se cumplen 24 horas de que el narcotraficante Joaquín Guzmán Loera, alias el Chapo Guzmán, se escapara de la cárcel, no de cualquier cárcel, sino nada menos que del penal de máxima seguridad de Puente Grande, Jalisco.
I wasn't shocked to think that he could get out. I knew how the apparatus for corruption was so ripe.
The early 2000s, the stars align in favor of Sinaloa. They're able to get the right people on the take in the Fox administration. They were able to guarantee a certain level of protection and also get the government to go after rival organizations like the Tijuana cartel.
This morning, Mexican government authorities captured Benjamin Ariana Felix.
It basically opened up a huge new opportunity for Guzman.
He went back to his home turf, to the mountains of Sinaloa and Durango, and he grew in importance to become probably the most prominent figure in Mexican organized crime during that decade.
Sinaloa is the cradle of drug trafficking in Mexico. It's like what Sicily is to Italian organized crime.
En Sinaloa, el narcotráfico es una presencia cotidiana que abarca prácticamente todos los sectores de la sociedad y de la vida pública.
En la sierra hay un fenómeno. La gente, desde pequeños, su modus vivendi es a base de la marihuana y de la amapola. Ese negocio, traemos los sinaloenses arraigado en la cultura. La gente de la sierra no lo ve como delito.
It is a very isolated area, controlled by the federal government in that area of Mexico has always been very tenuous.
Cuando el Chapo Guzmán se escapa, él va y se esconde ahí, donde podía sentirse tranquilo y seguro.
He reunited with Mayo Zambada. They came from the state and they understood each other.
El Chapo Guzmán decide convocar a una reunión de narcos. Llama a líder del cártel de Juárez, que también venía de Sinaloa. Convoca a Ismael El Mayo Zambada, que tenía Sonora y Sinaloa, junto con los Beltrán Leiva, que eran primos de El Chapo Guzmán.
The Beltrán Leiva brothers were very prominent in keeping him in the business while he was in prison in Puente Grande.
Y en esa reunión, lo que deciden es hagamos una gran federación de carteles. Compartimos nuestros territorios, compartimos nuestros contactos con quienes producen la droga en Colombia, en Bolivia y en Perú, y compartimos nuestros contactos con quienes distribuyen la droga en Estados Unidos y otras partes del mundo, y hacemos un gran consorcio de tráfico de drogas en el mundo.
Durante los 6 años de Fox, el Chapo Guzmán se dedicó a crecer su organización, a coaligarse sobre todo con los narcos de Sinaloa, que eran la mayoría de sus viejos amigos.
Methamphetamine was beginning to really take control in 2005. The Combat Meth Act was passed here in the United States, outlawing pseudoephedrine and ephedrine. That gave the cartels, particularly Sinaloa, the market.
They innovated in some ways of moving drugs into the U.S. This is the golden era of the tunnels.
If you took a giant knife along the 2,000-mile U.S.-Mexico border and you cut it, it would look like a block of Swiss cheese. It would be riddled with tunnels, and most of those tunnels belong to the Sinaloa cartel.
Eight killed and nearly 50 wounded. That was a recent weekend in Chicago. Homicides are up over 50% compared to last year.
Hands on top of your head, now go around to the back.
With nearly 70,000 members, Chicago is the most gang-populated city in America.
And I got to tell you, Chicago's become a hub for a number of the major cartels. It's our job to identify and attack those organizations. We're attacking at the highest possible level, even if that takes us to Mexico.
Put your hands behind your back.
Everybody that was anybody in the law enforcement community knew that the amount of narcotics that was hitting the street of Chicago, that was what underpinned the violence in the gangs, was a result of Chapo Guzmán's distribution of narcotics into Chicago.
Chicago is such an important hub for Sinaloa for a number of reasons. First of all, its availability for transport. The interstate highways, the rail, the trucking, even air travel. It's situated in the middle of the country. And I also think the strength of the street gangs were a real business opportunity that Chapo recognized and that Sinaloa really exploited.
The investigation starts right on the corner. We started buying heroin from some guy by the name of Chris Baines. So then we started to intercept Chris Baines' phone. And that took us to a gentleman by the name of Michael King, a pretty sizable mid-level distributor. We ended up spinning our phone up onto Michael, and during the course of that, we intercepted the Flores boys. Not necessarily knowing who they were at the time, but when we arrested Michael King, he was more than happy to tell us in exchange for some time off his sentence.
The Flores twins are the largest dope dealers ever to exist in the city of Chicago. They had customers throughout the Midwest, and that was Chapo's plan for them.
Pedro and Margarito Flores were already under indictment in Wisconsin as the source of supply for, I think, 5 kilos of cocaine, and had fled the U.S. and were running their operation from a house in Mexico.
They grew up in Chicago. They were bilingual, which was instrumental to their success. Their dad had been in the business, and they learned it and just elevated it to levels that were, I mean, jaw-dropping.
The twins' monthly distribution was approximately 1,500 to 2,000 kilos of cocaine a month, along with multiple kilo quantities of heroin. About every week to 10 days, they were sending somewhere between $4 and $6 million back. Their stature started to rise within the cartel, to the point where they ultimately had meetings with Chapo and other cartel leaders.
Not everyone can get an audience with Chapo in the mountains of Sinaloa, but there were occasions where each brother did meet face-to-face with Chapo.
Without the twins, we never get a chance to make this case. Then guys like Chapo Guzmán never see the inside of a U.S. courtroom.
In 2006, there's really this turning point in Mexico. Calderón became president, and Calderón decides to make fighting the drug war a major component of his administration.
El único camino hacia la paz y la libertad de los ciudadanos es encarar con firmeza y con determinación a la delincuencia organizada.
There was a moment when I took office when the power of the criminals were growing dramatically and the power of the state itself through the law enforcement agencies and its institutions was decreasing dramatically. I decided and announced to establish as a priority the rule of law. The American market is the biggest market for drugs. It was important to get the real cooperation of the United States.
Hemos tenido una conversación muy enriquecedora con el presidente Bush. Nuestro propósito común es fortalecer la relación bilateral entre México y Estados Unidos.
Calderón, with the staunch support of the U.S., decides to launch a so-called kingpin strategy. He decides to go after the heads of the major criminal organizations.
Chapo was the most visible leader of the most important or the biggest organization. So we allocated with the Americans a lot of resources to capture him.
We had 2 assaults on Chapo Guzmán. One was when he got married to Emma Coronel.
El Chapo Guzmán conoce a Emma Coronel cuando ella tenía 17 años en Durango. Cuando Emma estaba concursando para ser la reina de belleza de la Feria del Café y la Guayaba.
We knew the location of the ranch where the wedding had taken place. We launched several helicopters belonging to the Mexican military. There were about 40 to 50 individuals that jumped onto all-terrain vehicles, and they just spread out like cockroaches. Nobody knew which one was Chapo Guzmán.
When I took office, he had already a lot of control, or access at least at intelligence. He was able to observe any movement of troops in the region of Sinaloa.
El Chapo, working very closely with the Beltrán Leivas, built up a political machine that protected them. They had a number of officials at many levels of government that were providing information and were providing political cover. In early 2008, Alfredo Beltrán Leiva is captured by the Mexican army.
Alfredo Beltrán Leiva, alias El Mochomo, junto con sus hermanos, son responsables de las operaciones y seguridad del cártel de Sinaloa, que dirige Joaquín Guzmán Loera.
Arturo, his brother, has information that that capture was the result of El Chapo's complicity with the Mexican authorities. Whether that is true or not is still a matter of debate.
Ese evento que Arturo Beltrán Leiva entendió como una traición directa del Chapo Guzmán desencadena una guerra feroz.
I was covering this throughout 2008 and seeing some crazy things happening. In the city of Culiacan, the biggest city in Sinaloa, there would be shootouts in the plazas and people hiding under their tables in restaurants. And there'd be shootouts in like 4 or 5 places in a single day.
Yo no me había sentido más nervioso, nunca me he sentido más nervioso y con más miedo que en 2008 y 2009, cuando no sabías por dónde te podía llegar una bala.
I was arriving at crime scenes where there would be 500 bullets. Violence then was committed in a massive way by AK-47s and AR-15s. The assault weapons ban expired in the United States and was not renewed.
Somehow, a law that was supported by 68% of Americans is just fading away. The measure banned 19 types of semi-automatic rifles, commonly called assault weapons.
In the United States, the drug cartels began to buy them in huge numbers and bring them into Mexico.
It's all-out warfare between criminal organizations and the government, and everybody's toting massive weaponry. By sending troops all over the country and going after top drug traffickers, Calderon actually unleashes this incredible explosion of societal-wide violence.
Es importante que los criminales vayan comprendiendo algunas lecciones básicas, ¿no? Que es que en la medida en que se meten con la gente, en esa misma medida la acción del gobierno federal va a ser mucho más drástica y mucho más fuerte.
When Arturo Beltrán Leiva and Chapo start feuding, the problem for the twins, for the Flores brothers, was they're very soon going to have to pick a team in Mexico, and they're not going to be safe.
I understood that the Flores brothers were being pressured by each side because they were being supplied by each side, Arturo Beltrán Leiva on the one and Chapo on the other, to only do business with that side or else. I was approached through a representative of the Flores brothers, and I was told that they had expressed an interest in cooperating with the United States because that would ultimately result in their being protected. The next step then was we met, we picked a hotel in Monterey, It was a fairly James Bondian experience for me, not being quite used to these cloak and dagger kinds of things. I and the DEA agent that I was traveling with got picked up in an armor-plated Jeep, and then we were driven around the streets at 100 and some odd miles an hour to make sure nobody was following us. And we went very quickly into the standard hotel room, and there were a lot of diplomatic security, FBI, I think, DEA. Pedro was the only one who came. There were 3 or 4 big purposes of this. One was to see if he's serious about wanting to cooperate. And then to get a picture of his existing organization, how it operates, and then how are you going to cooperate with us, and what can you do while you're still here on the ground in Mexico, and what evidence can we collect against preferably higher people, but also lower people, to make a case.
We had the boys structure a call to get Chapo on the phone to discuss 20 kilos of heroin and see if they could get the price lowered.
Amigo.
¿Qué dice, oye? ¿Cómo está?
Bien, bien, saludarte. ¿Cómo están tus hermanos?
Todos bien, oye, aquí. Le quería pedir un favor.
Dime.
¿Usted cree que pues, lo podemos arreglar? ¿Me puede rebajar unos 5 pesos de esos?
¿Cómo tratamos?
Me lo está dando a 55.
¿Ya tienes el dinero?
Digo, si me los puede dejar, ¿verdad? La diferencia de 5 se los pago luego y si quiere mandarme más, pues...
¿Ya tienes el dinero?
Digo, si me los puede dejar...
Calls are incredibly helpful, particularly when you get to trial, because you have voice recordings of them in real time discussing their drug trafficking activity. At that time, I believe it was the only admissible voice recording of Chapo in the world.
The Flores brothers provided a treasure trove of Chapo information. It really solidified, I think, in my mind, in the prosecutor's mind, and most importantly, the suits in Washington, just how large and powerful this guy was, not in Mexico, but here in the domestic United States. So that, to me, was the home run.
The defendants whose indictments we announced today include alleged leaders of the Sinaloa and Beltran Leyva cartels, such as Joaquin Guzmán Loera, also known as Chapo, and Arturo Beltran Leyva. These cartels are not abstract organizations operating in far-off places. They are multi-billion-dollar networks funneling drugs onto our streets.
The drug cartels we bring to justice today are not indestructible. Rather, they are made up of men who commit crime. And through these indictments, these men will be left with lives on the run, looking over their shoulders. And they should be looking.
Fighting with Beltran Leivas creates a major logistical problem for El Chapo. Because the main route up to smuggle drugs into the U.S. was through Sonora, through Nogales, which was controlled by the Beltran Leivas. Suddenly, that route is blocked. So El Chapo takes a bold decision to move simultaneously into Tijuana and into Ciudad Juárez.
In Ciudad Juárez, the turf war erupted between Chapo Guzmán's faction of the Sinaloan drug trafficking empire and the Juárez cartel. But then it got to whole new levels because the cartels brought in street gangs to fight for them.
Right behind me is the body of a man who's been murdered. That kind of thing happens every day here in Ciudad Juárez. Gangs have also burned down businesses and tortured their owners to squeeze out protection money.
Sometimes they attack targets by mistake. Sometimes the murderers would go after one person and kill everybody they're with.
There were massacres here, there were massacres there. You could just kill at will and know that the chances of ever being caught were very, very slim.
They came to pay their last respects and remember the boys on the block. 6 weeks for students gunned down at a birthday party just down the street. Jesus Segovia was just 15.
There were kids who had been playing baseball, and they won the tournament. 16 people were killed. This is a Villa Salvarcar massacre.
According to authorities, a band of hitmen working for a drug cartel are behind the killings.
I had been covering this for decades, and that, to me, was the hardest story I've ever covered. This is a tiny little street, and you're seeing 7, 9 hearses waiting for these coffins. At some houses had 1, 2 coffins. They couldn't afford a funeral home. They're hard-working people who had dreams for their children, for themselves. The pain, the level of despair, the level of vulnerability.
You're seeing the trauma as a community. You're looking at real lives destroyed, taken apart here.
The bloodshed and extortion rage on, despite more than 10,000 soldiers and police trying to lock the city down.
A como vamos, pues donde quiera hay soldados y donde quiera hay muchas cosas, pero la matadera nunca se ha acabado.
The cartels, their mentality is we can take on the government. We don't respect the government anymore. They become players fighting for the fate of the country. The state was not in control.
Several police corporations were completely either eroded by corruption or intimidated by the criminals. Was a crucial factor that can allow us to end the job, to get the job done.
Por tu culpa, Felipe Calderón, mataron a los demás, a mi esposo. Me quedé viuda por tu culpa. Hágase justicia.
By 2012, you had somewhere around 60,000 people who had died.
When the number of disappeared and presumed dead is added, that figure is more than 100,000.
The Sinaloa cartel was clearly the dominant criminal organization at that point.
Toda esta operación de Felipe Calderón no fue una guerra contra las drogas, fue una guerra a favor del cártel de Sinaloa.
That reporter is a liar. We fought all those cartels and groups and with the same force.
Lo único que sé es que el Chapo siguió creciendo. Con todo y la guerra fracasada que desató Calderón y se consolidó como el gran capo de este país.
We're going to have a very extraordinary announcement this morning, one that the Crime Commission hasn't made since 1930. We're going to name a new America's Most Wanted criminal. We're using this title, which we first gave to Al Capone in 1930, and this is the second time we've ever felt necessary to use it.
In 2013, they designated Chapo as public enemy #1. It was symbolic, but it was also a statement that what this individual is doing by supplying all of this stuff is causing real harm here in Chicago.
Chapo Guzmán has gone on to become one of the 3 most infamous gangsters in modern history, along with Pablo Escobar and Al Capone.
Much like what was done in the 20s and 30s against traditional organized crime, we're going to make a dent on the organizations, from the street gang to the transporters, all the way to Chapo Guzmán, who's hiding in the mountains of Mexico. And I'm here to tell you, if there's any bad guys out there that watch anything that you guys put out, we're coming.